Testing, testing. Okay, that's working. It's actually a tiny bit cold in here, so I'm going to put on a long sleeve shirt. If I didn't actually mention this, and then in the next video, I just happen to be in a different shirt, it might be weird. I decided to just kind of fill you in on why the sudden wardrobe change. Design process, here we go. It's important to understand the high-level overview for the process because it's really easy to get stuck on the individual details without knowing the larger strategy. Choosing the color and the style of a button is important, but more importantly is what is the strategy behind a button's existence in the first place. So even though we're going to cover lots and lots of details about designing great buttons, it's really important, in my opinion, to just kind of set the stage for a large strategy and then dive in to all those little details. Understanding the problem you're trying to solve with interface design is top priority before you begin to design anything. And the more complex the problem being solved is, the more important your role is to understand that problem fully before you can attempt to design the visual aspect of the interface. So there's 8 steps that I have come up with that kind of are the overarching elements of my design process. So number 1 is understanding the problem. Number 2 is determining the complexity. 3 is using lists, content maps, flows, and things like that to guide the project. Number 4 would be deciding to wireframe or not based on that complexity. Number 5 would be setting the design direction, the creative style, the look and the feel. Number 6 would be presenting early and often to get feedback. Number 7 would be exploring more color styles, more design styles, and iterating those and nailing those down and exploiting those once you have a really good system in place. And number 8 is really creating that system and expanding it. But for this particular video, I want to focus mostly on the complexity and letting that determine whether or not you would wireframe or not, or what your process would be based on the complexity of the project you're designing for. Let's start with high complexity. Now, I've worked on a lot of really complex projects, but one that comes to mind is this responsive dashboard and mobile application that was used for managing thermal cameras to monitor industrial equipment for heat signatures during the operation. Now, none of this had any design, and I was tasked to figure it all out. And this particular project started with lots and lots of whiteboarding, putting together each task inside of a spreadsheet. And this isn't the type of project that is going to be the focus of the course, but it's important to point out that there is always a larger problem being solved by a business for its customers. And the interface design in that project is just a stepping stone in solving that larger problem. Not all complex design projects have to deal with such an intense subject matter. Some seemingly simple projects might be really complex because you have to deal with multiple teams, multiple stakeholder sign-offs, and maybe a lot more corporate structure. So for this high complexity project, this is a look at all of the mobile wireframes for this project. I typically don't do large scale, large screen size wireframes because mobile helps you prioritize all of the features in just a very linear format. So we've got new account, optional info, getting started, creating assets. We've got network profiles, groups, notification lists. It definitely was very complex. So we're monitoring thermal images here. We're looking for heat signatures. And like I said, none of this was designed before we started on this. So we had to start off asking tons of questions, doing lots of sketches, whiteboarding, asking questions. I've got text file after text file of notes and notes and notes where I asked the people who are creating this, these cameras and this whole system, just asking them questions about how the people come in and monitor the equipment, how it's expected to be used. It was me and another designer that I hired to work on this project together. So we're just creating all these different sketches, trying to get a lot of answers to our questions solved, trying to figure out the hierarchy of all of these just different pieces and different components to the actual project. And once we had an idea of how this could work, it was really too complex to even go straight into the design. So I created these spreadsheets that would kind of just document the features and the flow. So it's like, okay, first you have to log into your account. And this is assuming that you would have to, you know, if you don't have an account, you would need to create one, and you couldn't create an account until you bought their hardware. So there are a lot of assumptions that go into designing this interface before we even design the interface. So we're creating assets, we're setting up cameras, downloading the app, and, you know, putting some notes around here. And this isn't a very specific process. It's just a matter of just understanding the information that you're going to design for. And then once we had an idea of all of these things, only then could I go in here and create these low fidelity designs for account, assets, and all that. So I don't want you to get too caught up in a crazy complex project and let this overwhelm you, because this isn't really the focus of the actual course, but I do want to kind of set some groundwork for you to be able to understand how complex things can possibly be and how you need to really understand this information before you go designing an interface for a project like this, or at least have someone on your team or someone you're working with who is doing this work that you need to talk to and ask a lot of questions just before you can effectively design for something of this scale. So not all problems you encounter as an interface designer are going to actually be visual problems. And the more situational awareness you have, the better you'll be at your job. So the way to create more situational awareness is just simply by asking questions and taking survey of the landscape and the nature of the people you're working with. Just like anything, this gets easier the more you do it. So in a project with high complexity, I start off with lots of just sketching, whiteboarding ideas for flows, asking tons of questions about functionality, and trying to soak up as much subject matter as I can. A lot of times this results in having to document things inside of a spreadsheet. Again, this is more of strategy, UX thinking. It doesn't really apply directly and practically into visual interface, but I do just want to let you know that this game is being played in the product world, you know, surrounding the interface design. In a project of medium complexity, I might create some wireframes or low fidelity designs, as I kind of like to call them, because wireframes has a bad stigma. And I like to really nail down the functionality of the product and get confirmation from stakeholders before moving into actual UI designs. Now, not all medium complexity projects need this, but it can be really helpful. Stakeholders can be anybody with an opinion or involvement in the project, and really any factor. But primarily the stakeholder is going to be the decision maker who can give your design the green light. Okay, now I want to pull up a medium complexity project that was probably on the slightly higher side of complexity in terms of actual projects. This is a cryptocurrency desktop wallet app for a cryptocurrency called MyMonero. And I'm just going to kind of show you a few of these screens. I don't want to really go into too much crazy detail because it would be not that relevant, but I just want to show you some of the things like logging into your wallet, choosing a color, signing in, sending Monero to other people. Now, I didn't know much about cryptocurrency or even definitely not Monero before I started this, so it required a lot of questions on my part for the developer. Fortunately, I was working directly with the CEO and the lead developer on the project. So this was a lot more easy to kind of understand. And I didn't just jump right into doing the visual side of the design here because it was more complex. I actually created a number of wireframes for the app before I really kind of jumped in. And even before I designed the wireframes, I designed a content map. And again, this is based off of just asking lots of questions about the information, how it makes sense to separate things, and all of that. So there's no real big, very specific process you need to use for this, just whatever helps you. Some people like to use sticky notes on a whiteboard. Some people like to use sketchbooks. But for me, I like to have a little bit more of a formal document that I can share with a client or a teammate or whoever that actually has a little bit more of refinement to it, so it kind of feels like an official document. It has a little bit more valuable because it has a little bit more perceived value because it's nice and organized, it's labeled, and things are kind of more official. So just kind of scanning over this, we've got account details, We've got you can have multiple wallets inside of the app. So there's creating a wallet, logging into a wallet, the details, the mnemonic that you use to log into it, different actions that you can do within the wallet, things that you can view within the wallet. And then we've got some transactions. We've got sending and receiving the cryptocurrency. We've got some contacts. We've got transactions that you can import from another wallet and some other just kind of miscellaneous things. And so I would create this after asking a bunch of questions and then send it back. We'd kind of go back and forth and say, actually, in a transaction, it helps produce more conversations with the people involved. And once we have this kind of locked in or feeling at least pointed in a good direction, only then would I go and say, okay, now I know that my wallets and my transactions and my contacts are main important sections. So now I can go in and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to have a main navigation that says wallets. There's going to be send and request, which are two different transaction types. And then I'm going to have my contacts and my settings. Now, I did all of these wireframes in Illustrator, which I don't really use that often. This was probably back in 2017, January 2017, just to give you an idea. But you can see, like, I'm just kind of designing these. It's very minimal. I mean, it's detailed, but it's also minimal. I'm not really worried too much about specific colors or specific typefaces. I'm just using gray and black and white and blue to kind of just map out this process. And I like to break it up into different features. So this is like sending, and this is receiving. And it's just kind of playing out some different wireframes. So only then, now that I have these wireframes and I've had these conversations with the stakeholders, can I go in and actually start designing and laying this out. So in my opinion, this is a great example of when I was really thankful that I was able to go through the process of creating the wireframes, because a lot of this was just over my head and I had to really spend some critical time thinking about the functionality and how everything was going to work before I could get in here and start, designing the color of the icons and the subtle inner shadows and thinking about like colors and shapes and typography and things like that. So this is an example where it really helped to wireframe and then move into visual design. Now, for other projects that might have medium complexity but not quite as complicated, it might make sense to jump straight into visual design for you if you have a solid list to go off of. So it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just kind of what makes sense for your project. So when you're dealing with a medium complexity project, it can be helpful to separate the functionality conversations that you have with developers or stakeholders from the visual conversations that you have with those same people. So you're talking about features and flows versus typography and color. A lot of times it's better to separate those when there's any level of complexity involved. But not every time. It really depends on the project and your preferred style of working. There haven't been as many projects where I've regretted doing wireframes, but there definitely have been times where I wished that I would have started with wireframes. And I know this is a taboo topic. It's incredibly nuanced. And I don't mean wireframing and annotating and detailing every little tiny thing, but sometimes it just helps to get it out on paper like a digital sketch. In a lower complexity project, it's often fine to jump straight into visual design and bypass any elaborate wireframing design exercise because the functionality is much more straightforward. A great example of this would be like a simple app with a limited number of features or a marketing website created with a small team. In both of those examples, the functionality is mostly defined and agreed upon by everyone involved from the very beginning. And all that remains is creating a really nice interface for the product. This is definitely easier said than done, which is why the craft of interface design is so highly valued in the tech industry. But it is worth repeating again that it's critical to understand the problem to the best of your ability before and during your interface design process. Now, for a low complexity example, I want to show you this app that I created with my friend Sam Sophis. It's an app called Contrast that lets you have quick access to color contrast accessibility scores. Here is the app in action. You can see I pull it off here. I can select a color. and choose that. So I can see if my scores are passing or not. So this was a simple little app, and I didn't do any wireframing whatsoever. I did a little tiny sketch for this little app. I mean, you could consider this a wireframe, but this was one of the first sketches that I did. And then I just started designing it because I kind of already knew it was so simple, and we already knew what the features were going to be. It was going to be very minimal and simple, just a simple little menu flyout. So you don't need to do wireframes when you know what something is going to do already, and both parties involved, developer and designer, and in our case, we were both stakeholders. When everybody's on the same page about the functionality and the requirements, then you can really just jump straight into design and kind of explore that way. So I'll put links to all of these project files down below, and you can check them out for yourself. But it's just, I want to stress that kind of understanding and determining the project complexity before you really dive in will really help you out and kind of point you in the best direction for your project. So for homework, I want you to take, again, one of your current projects, an active project, or a conceptual app, or even your personal website, and take some notes on the following. Is the team complex and layered, or is it just one or two people? Are the features that you'll be designing for very complex, or are they very straightforward? Would it be helpful to focus on the general layout and functionality, or would it be just as fine to go straight into visual design? Now, this is usually going to be your decision to make unless you're working with a team that has a very specific process. So keep in mind this design process overview and let this dictate your approach to the start of your new projects. And we'll cover some low fidelity design and definitely jumping into visual side of things, but I just wanted this to be an overarching thing for you to keep in mind before we dig into all of the details.